Victory Studios in downtown Little Rock, this is Capitol View.
Well, if there is anyone besides a family member that knew David Pryor any better, it would have to be our next guest, and that is Skip Rutherford, longtime aide to Senator David Pryor and former dean of the Clinton School of Public Service. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Robbie, for having me.
I want you to tell me of when did you meet David Pryor? What was do you remember that introduction, and maybe you even knew of him before you met him, sort of thing?
I knew of him well before I met him because my next door neighbors growing up in Batesville had taught David Pryor, coached David Pryor and the Pryor family in Camden before they settled in Batesville.
Okay.
And then when he was in the legislature, he was a young Turk. And one of those young Turks was Virgil Butler from Batesville, an older young Turk. But Representative Butler, family friend, just gave glowing reports about this young state legislator from Camden. But when I was a senior at the University of Arkansas, getting ready to enter my senior year, Ernie Dean, journalism professor, former Arkansas Traveler writer, asked me to go to the Arkansas Press Association with him. I was going to be editor of the student newspaper. He wanted me to meet all these people. He said, and by the way, there's an off-the-record briefing with Congressman David Pryor, an off-the-record session with members of the press, and I'd like you to join me in there. He said, I've cleared it that you can sit in. And it was my first time to see the press and Pryor go back and forth and talk openly, honestly, off-the-record background. But I left that meeting thinking, he's just exactly what my neighbor said. He's just exactly what Virgil Butler told me. And so in 1972, I had a Pryor commitment, and it's been that way all my life.
Did you volunteer, or were you a paid worker for his Senate campaign in '72?
I was not a paid worker. I was editor of the Arkansas Traveler, so I had to.
Oh, you got to cover him.
Well, I got to cover him, but I also had to have some degree of neutrality, editor. I volunteered in '78 campaign.
Tell me what impressed you about him, the way he came across, the way he connected with voters, how he spoke, what he championed. What were the things that drew you into his orbit?
What really drew me into his orbit was the fact that he related so well to people. He was always a champion of the underdog. He always was someone that I knew about his work for the elderly in nursing homes, advocating for the elderly. I knew about his work fighting the State Sovereignty Commission. I knew about his work in civil rights. I knew about his work for the poor. And that's what attracted me to him, was that this was a guy who was genuine, honest, fair, and open-minded.
Yeah, why do you think he had some of that particular political DNA in terms, particularly on civil rights issue? He grew up in South Arkansas during a time of segregation. I mean, this was an evolution when he would have seen it, but yet he is probably one of the things he's best known for is the fact that he was a champion for civil rights and appointed a lot of people of color to different boards and commissions during his time as governor.
Well, my initial thought on that, and I've thought about it a long time, and quite frankly, I never asked him. But I think a lot of it probably had to do with his mother, Susie Pryor, who was just a wonderful, wonderful woman.
Yeah. What was she like a little bit? Did you get to know her?
Oh, I did. Yeah. She was the first woman to run for office in Arkansas after women were given the right to vote. So you can see how her young son, David Pryor, would see his mom standing out against, a woman running for office. What an example, what a role model.
Yeah.
I think that championed his entire life.
So you were a newspaper editor for the student newspaper in that 72 McClellan versus Pryor Senate campaign, which was one of the most epic Senate campaigns of all political history in Arkansas. Kind of, what do you remember about that race? And I mean, it was a dogfight, and I mean, it was old guard versus new guard, and that debate that they had that is so memorable. I mean, what are some of your recollections of the race?
What I really remember about the race was that David Pryor got McClellan in a runoff, And a lot of people thought, okay, if you get the incumbent in a runoff, you're likely to win. And so election night, quite frankly, again, pretty young, was not only a surprise, but a big disappointment to me. But when I started learning about the politics of Arkansas and how the McClellan organization went to work, how they started getting voters who had not voted in the primary to vote in the runoff, put a whole bunch of money into it, I realized there's a different side of politics than just being for someone I like.
Yeah. So you went to work for him in '78?
I did.
And that would have been when he went to the U.S. Senate?
Yeah, when he went to the U.S. Senate, I moved to Little Rock to run his Arkansas office.
All right. What was it like taking? I mean, he actually won the office that McClellan had held, but obviously he'd passed away. And as governor, he'd gotten to appoint Kanister Hodges into that seat temporarily until he won the election. That '78 race was another epic race there with Jim Guy Tucker and Ray Thornton, and being as close as it was.
Yeah, three great. And you know, it's interesting that this is a great tribute to all three of those guys, that they were friends before the campaign started, and they ended up friends afterwards. And Jim Guy Tucker, David Pryor, and Ray Thornton got along, and I thought, what a great example of a brutal campaign that these guys were still friends. I remember at Ray Thornton's funeral service, Jim Guy Tucker had been sitting with Ray Thornton in the hospital, and David Pryor gave one of the eulogies, and I thought, this is good. This is what politics should be.
Yeah. I think another thing that amazes me about that era in particular is obviously Pryor is one of the big three with Bill Clinton and Dale Bumpers, and they never ran against each other. It just kind of worked itself out, sort of, or did it maybe there was some things happening behind the scenes to keep them from running against each other.
Well,
and I think that led to a very tight bond between the three of them.
Yeah, well, there's always things happening behind the scenes. But David Pryor and Dale Bumpers had the United States Senate seats. And I think we're strong enough to fend off anybody. Anybody.
Yeah. I think there's a great story that David Pryor tells in the Men of Distinction series that aired on AETN many years ago, where Clinton was thinking about running for the U.S. Senate seat when Pryor was thinking about running for the U.S. Senate seat. I don't know how far along he was. I think he was AG at the time. And they took a car ride to Hot Springs together, I think to go open up Magic Springs amusement park down there. And somehow after that car ride, Clinton was not interested in running for the U.S. Senate anymore.
Well, you know, again, politics be what it may.
Power, persuasion.
The three developed a great friendship and support base. Bumpers and Pryor were strong supporters of Clinton during his presidency. And I think back on that, and as you look, it was really an era of politics that we may not experience again.
Yeah. Tell me a story, tell viewers and listeners a story about something that just epitomizes the kind of guy that David Pryor was. If you didn't have a chance to know him personally, but you've read about him, or maybe you've seen him a little bit, but not up and close and personal, something that you think just makes him the memorable political figure that he is.
We were at a anniversary celebration of the Arkansas Educational Television Network, AETN, now Arkansas PBS. Orville Faubus was governor when AETN started, and Orville Faubus was the featured speaker at this anniversary. I believe at the time he was Director of Veterans Affairs for Governor White.
Right.
And he spoke, and he said, in his speech, he said very nice things about his longtime rival and a person who had been against him since he was a young Turk. Fought everything that Faubus stood for. Pryor was on the other side. But in that speech, Pryor listened as Faubus praised him. And at the conclusion of that speech, he looked over at me and he said, "Hey, you don't have to go with me tomorrow." I think they were going to Kensett or Searcy. We were going. He said it was a veterans ceremony the next day. He said, you don't have to go with me tomorrow. And I said, well, okay. Well, why? He said, because I'm going to call Orville Faubus and ask him to ride with me. And I said, you're going to do what? He said, I'm going to call Orville Faubus and ask him to ride with me. And he looked at me and he said, Skip, hate is a terrible thing. Hate is a terrible thing. And he said, I have today, Orville Faubus showed me that it was time to end this. And I'm going to reciprocate, and I'm going to call him, and we're going to drive, just the two of us, and we're going to talk. And that opened a door of a relationship that they did communicate, that Faubus came to see Pryor in the hospital when he had heart surgery. And when Governor Faubus was diagnosed with cancer, few people know this, David Pryor drove him to some of his cancer treatments. I mean, this was the Sovereignty Commission, this was everything against that. All of a sudden, Pryor said, hate's a terrible thing, we need to stop it. And they ended up, not political pals, but personal friends.
Yeah.
That was big. That was big for Governor Faubus. It was big for David Pryor.
Yeah. Skip Rutherford, we could sit here for another hour and tell stories, but they're not going to let me do it in the studio. Thank you for being here. All right.